Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second day of the Climate Adaptation Research for British Columbia Agriculture virtual workshop. So my name is John Janmat. I'm a professor of economics at the Okanagan campus of UBC. And my interest in this particular webinar stems from a couple of projects and personal interest in agriculture that I'm involved with. One that's looking at the institutional environment around agricultural adaptation to climate change. And in that research, wildfire keeps coming up as a concern, particularly in the Caribou region where part of our research is being undertaken. And another project that I'm involved with is focused specifically on how do we live better with wildfire in landscapes where wildfire is a normal part of the ecology, such as the interior of BC. So I'm quite excited to hear what our presenters are going to be presenting to us. Now let me begin with an acknowledgement of the lands where we are living. So we are here, I am here situated in the traditional territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And I'm sure that all of you are joining from different places and different traditional territories here in British Columbia. And just like to acknowledge all of the peoples who were here before us settlers arrived and took care of the lands. And in many cases, were living with wildfire and using fire as part of their management of the landscape before we arrived. And we're grateful for their hosting us on their lands. So if you joined us yesterday or have been part of one of our early events, you'll know that the mission of the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network is to increase collaboration to better meet the research and extension needs of the British Columbia agricultural sector as they adapt to climate change. We work to foster connections and dialogue between researchers and industry, across regions, across disciplines, and across institutions. This is our 6th annual provincial workshop, and it's become an important opportunity to discuss new research focused on adapting to and mitigating climate impacts in the agricultural sector and to connect people working on these topics. I encourage you to use this session as a chance to introduce yourself and connect with others who are joining using the chat box. You can share where you were joining from and why you joined us today. These workshops would not be possible without funding, and I would like to thank our funders for their continued support. Funding for this event has been provided in part by an anonymous donor and in part by the governments of Canada and British Columbia under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, so a federal-provincial-territorial initiative. Today's sessions focus on wildfire. The massive impacts of wildfire are having on BC farmers, ranchers, communities, and ecosystems have shown that working together is the only way to respond to these events. To open the wildfire sessions, Dr. Mike Flannigan, Research Chair of Predictive Services, Emergency Management and Fire Science at Thompson Rivers University, and Scientific Director of the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science, will give us a look into what climate and fire science tells us about the future of wildfire in British Columbia. Following Mike's presentation, Amanda Miller, Principal Ecologist at Palouse Rangeland Consulting and the BC Cattlemen's Association, will share results from research trials that show how targeted grazing can be used to manage fine fuels and reduce wildfire risk. After each presentation, we will have a break for questions and answers. You can type your questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find in your Zoom control panel. In that same Q&A box, you can also upvote others' questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. That will bring the question up to the top of the queue, and we will ask those questions first. So it's now my pleasure to pass things over to Dr. Mike Flannigan. Dr. Flannigan is an award-winning researcher and leading expert on wildfire behavior and landscape fire modeling. He recently accepted a new position at Thompson Rivers University as the new British Columbia Research Chair in Predictive Services, Emergency Management, and Fire Science. He also continues to be the Scientific Director of the Canadian Partnership for Wildland Fire Science. We are pleased to be able to open today's session with Dr. Flannigan. Welcome.
Thanks, John, and hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear my voice. Okay, great. So this morning I'm going to talk about wildfires and climate change. Thanks for the introduction, John. And it's great to be with you virtually this morning. I look forward to the day when we meet in person. This is the Wildland Fire 2017, if memory serves. And yeah, it's becoming a common situation in British Columbia these days to see massive columns. So I'm going to talk about fire in Canada and British Columbia, climate change briefly, impacts of climate change and wildfire, and then very briefly what can we do, okay? Another picture of another fire. You're going to see a few of these. This is Elephant Hill 2017, July 14th. It was a Friday afternoon, and it was hot, dry, and windy, okay? It was, yeah. I like this slide. It's from a paper from last year by David Bowman and others, and just kind of shows how the role fire plays in the climate system, and that it's Earth system, climate systems, hydrosphere, cryosphere, biosphere. It has so many interactions, and you know, I'm a fire guy, so I like this slide. So in Canada, we get about 6,000 fires, depending the last 10 years, just around 6,000 fires, 2.7 million hectares, half the size of Nova Scotia. For BC, it's not that much smaller than the size of Vancouver Island. So it is a big chunk of real estate. BC, between 2011 and 2020, 1,300 fires burned about 350,000 hectares. And that's increasing, as you might imagine. And, you know, number of fires and area burned are probably not the best metrics to use, but they're the easiest ones to obtain. It's really about impact, but how do you measure impact? You know, this year in 2021, there was loss of life, and sadly, the town of Lytton and other structures were lost and communities affected this year. So it was a very impactful year. As probably everyone knows, the top 3 years in terms of area burned in British Columbia since 1950 were in the last 5 years, 2018, 2017, 2021, respectively. So lightning fires in Canada and in British Columbia are responsible for about 50% of the ignitions, but are responsible for most of the area burned. And the thing is that this is increasing, you know, since you know, the 70s, the number of human-caused fires and area burned from human-caused fires has been going down. And this may be due to education, fire bans, fire management, but they're going down. But lightning fires have more than compensated. Our area burned has doubled since the early 70s, primarily due to human-caused climate change. You know, and compared to places like Western United States and California, where the increase has been by a factor of 4 or 5, this is maybe what's coming our way. Important thing about fire, it's all about the extremes. 3% of the fires burn 3% of the fires burn 97% of the area burned. Western United States, 1% of the fires burn 99% of the area. And much of this happens on a few critical days of extreme fire weather. Like the slide I showed you from July 14, 2017, Elephant Hill Fire. That was just ripping that day. There's seasonal variation in fire cause. Spring and fall are dominated by human-caused lightning in the summer, and the spring and fall fires are often what we call grass fires. And cured grass is very flammable, as probably everyone knows. Green grass is very effective fire break. So this just shows a slide of area burned by decades, and you can see it's not just a BC issue, but it goes from C to C to C. But notice the red is the most recent decade, and that's when we see a lot in British Columbia. Prior to that, there wasn't a heck of a lot. So BC is really on uptick. This shows evacuations, and once again, you see lots in British Columbia, but it goes from C, you see them in Newfoundland, to C to C. You see it in the upper Yukon. You can see places, I forget that was Old Crow that was evacuated, but and these are increasing. So as I mentioned, it's about impacts, and you don't have to think back very far. Slave Lake, 2011, Fort McMurray, 2016. At the time, and still is the costliest disaster in modern Canadian history. I got a feeling the recent floods in BC is going to surpass that. But you just have to look globally, and you see significant fires all over the globe. And this year, of course, BC, Saskatchewan, we had a lot of fire in Canada, California, Siberia, Turkey, Greece, a lot of fatalities in Algeria this year, lots and lots of fire globally. And fire has direct effects, i.e. communities, that can burn down, forests that burn, but then there's the smoke that can travel thousands of kilometers and change air quality for periods of time. That's this slide in the bottom that was taken this summer. And folks in the interior valleys know all about smoke in the fire season. And now areas that have been recently burned are more prone or more likely to mudslides and flooding. I'm not saying that they're the cause of all the flooding and problems we've seen, but they are a contributor. So this is a recipe for a wildfire. And whether you're in BC, the Amazon, Australia, the Arctic, this recipe applies. Vegetation, we call it fuel. How much, what type, how's it structured, vertically and horizontally, and probably most importantly, moisture. How dry is that fuel? Ignition, we've already talked about humans and lightning. Weather, hot, dry, windy. There's even a fire weather index called hot, dry, windy, okay? But it's really about those extreme conditions. Fires aren't a problem on an average day. During summer, it's those hot, dry, windy days that we have to be really careful about. Now, talking about greenhouse gases, the sun is about 6,000 degrees. It emits most of its energy as shortwave radiation. The Earth's about 300 degrees Kelvin, and it emits most of its energy as long waves. In our atmosphere, we have so-called greenhouse gases like water vapor and carbon dioxide that are more or less transparent to the short waves, solar radiation, but opaque to the longer waves from the Earth. So it traps the heat in, and carbon dioxide is one of them. Now there's this natural greenhouse effect that's at play, and we'd be a much colder world without it, but human activity has enhanced this. And now, I liken it to a cold winter night. You throw another blanket on the bed, it keeps you warm, and that's exactly what we're doing. So this graph here is from the Big Island, Hawaii, and this is the first place that started monitoring carbon dioxide. And it's going up and up and up, and this is due to greenhouse gases being emitted from fossil fuels, etc. And we're approaching 420 parts per million. The last time the Earth has seen 420 parts per million was 3.5 million years ago. So we're getting quite, no human prior to right now is seeing numbers like this. And of course, temperatures are going up. 2020 was probably number 2 on the list, but what was unusual about it is it wasn't an El Nino year, okay? So we are warming, and we will continue to warm, and this is important to fire. I'll get to that in a second. Now, hopefully, when you do animations, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Hopefully you can see this. The year is in the bottom center, and this is an American product, so it's in degrees F, but the yellows and reds are much warmer than average, and the blues are colder than average. And you can see as we move to the 70s, the Earth starts to become a much, much warmer place. Those are observations, okay? Now, this is from Canada's Changing Climate Report from a few years ago. Canada's warming at twice the rate of the rest of the globe, and the Arctic areas at 3 or 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. And you can see that the warming on that map on the left is concentrated in the west and the north. And this is where we've seen much of the fire activity recently, is in the west and the north. Now here's another animation, and hopefully this one works too. I have to click this one to get this guy going. And once again, this is a Canadian product. So it's in degrees Celsius. Once again, the reds and oranges are warmer than normal, the blues are colder than normal. And this is projections. This is a Canadian model. And you can see the year in the top, just off to the right center. And it's a much warmer world, which is really kind of scary in a number of reasons. And we will see a lot more extreme weather. We're already seeing it, but this may be the tip of the iceberg, and whether it's droughts and fires and rain and flooding, we're going to see more and more of that. So, you know, this is, you know, business as usual. I'm not sure if we'll get our act together or not. So my colleagues and I have been studying fire for many decades, and I'd say since, you know, the last 3 decades, we found a relationship between temperature and fire activity. And people say, well, why is temperature so important? And here I'm not talking about an individual fire like the Lytton fire. I'm talking about fire over a larger area, like British Columbia, for a longer period of time, fire season, a decade, things like that. There's 3 reasons. Fire people love 3s, by the way. The warmer it is, the longer the fire season, so more opportunities to burn. And we're seeing that already in places in Canada where our fire seasons are longer. You know, just last week, Penticton was 22.5 degrees Celsius on December 1st, which tied the record for the warmest day in December in all of Canada. You know, so that's yeah. And there were lots of fires in Montana and fires in Alberta last week as well. So, you know, longer fire seasons. The warmer it gets, the more lightning we see. And as I've mentioned, the reason we're seeing more area burned is because of lightning caused fires. And the third reason is probably the most important, is as the temperature warms, the atmosphere's ability to suck moisture right out of the fuel increases almost exponentially. So unless we see increases in precipitation to compensate for this drying effect from warming, fuels are going to be drier. And this is critical because the warmer it is, the drier the fuels, okay? Drier the fuel, easier it is for fires to start, spread, and more fuels available to burn, which leads to higher intensity fires, which can be difficult to impossible to extinguish. So this is work by the US National Assessment, and it's by season. And you'll notice in British Columbia that there are areas for the summer, our fire season, where it's going to be drier. So it looks warmer and drier, and that is a recipe for fire. All right. And you know, it's all about the extremes. So this is just an example, you know, and you can see the purple, and what used to be a distribution of, you know, 1 out of 60 times you get this event. And with just shifting to the right, and now becomes 1 out of 5. And we're seeing that with return periods. You say, oh, this flood or this heat event is a 1 in 100 year, 1 in 200 year, 1 in 500 year, but they're happening every few years now. So, you know, our climate is changing, and because of this shift to more extreme conditions. And recall, extreme conditions drive our fire world. Speaking of extreme conditions, there's a recent paper out by colleagues of mine, and there's FWI, which is the Fire Weather Index, which is indicative of the intensity of a spreading fire. ISI, initial spread in, this is on the left-hand side. This is representative of how fast the fire might spread, and vapor pressure deficit, VPD. This means how much that atmosphere is trying to suck the moisture out of the fuel. And these are 95th percentile trends. So extremes, the trends and the extremes. And what they're saying is, hey, there's significant increase. These are observations in this. And with warming, I expect this will only continue. So, what's been happening in California we may be the British California where almost every year is a bad fire season. Now, I'm not going to say that yet because there's a lot of year-to-year variability. Some years are summers, fire seasons are cooler and wetter than others, but more and more likely we're going to see bad fire season. Now, the graph on the right is a global extremes, and the top 8 have been in the last decade. So extreme fire weather, in British Columbia and around the world is becoming more common, which is not good news for more fire activity. Here's another paper that just came out last week, and it's looking at trends in fine fuel moisture, like grass, okay? And this is dead or cured grass and other fine fuels, needles, leaves. And you can see that there's even more red on this, which means the trend is that fine fuels are getting drier. And once again, drier fuels, easier fire start, spread, and more likely more fuel to burn. So, yeah, that's a pretty bleak picture I just painted, okay? What can we do? Well, every community needs an emergency management plan, and not just for fire, for floods, earthquake, etc. Update the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System, and that's ongoing. They have a 5-year timeline, 2025. That may be a bit optimistic, but they are making progress. Parts of it are 40 to 50 years old. Need an enhanced early warning system so that we can move resources to locations where we expect extreme fire activity. But those are for unwanted fires. And I'm not sure if we have time, but there are arguably wanted fires on the landscape. We should not eliminate fire from the landscape. It's natural. Our forests are used to them. They survive and thrive and in fire. Some species need fire for regeneration. So we have to allow fire when and where possible. More remote sensing. There's a program called Wildfire Sat Canada, satellite dedicated for Canadian wildfires. Build emergency shelters in some locations. This can be a multi-purpose building. It can be a town hall, arena. So evacuations aren't always necessary because many times we evacuate as a precaution and the town does not burn down, but they are traumatic events. They really are. So use Indigenous and local knowledge. This is something that we haven't done a good job at. Hopefully that's changing. Explore fuel management in concert with harvesting, burning, and grazing. Amanda will be talking a fair bit more about grazing and fire in a few minutes. Building materials, very important. Community planning. Emergency management has different phases: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. Some people include review. Fire is great at response, and we do some preparedness, but prevention and mitigation, there's more that we can do because it does pay off. And now the prevention is worth a pound of cure. Of course, Fire Smart Canada, fuel management. There's 7 principles. We hear a lot about fuel management, but that's just one of them. Training, communication, cooperation, education, and Fire Smart Canada. Check it out if you haven't not familiar with it. It can help make your community more fire resilient. So fire and weather are strongly related. The pictures on the right are Fort McMurray, 2016 May I took on the top, and the bottom the student took in the following fall. But I did go back to Fort McMurray, 2017, 2018, and not all of them look like that bottom picture. There were some areas where regeneration was really poor. Changes in the fire regime, fire activity may be the first sign of climate change in our forest. Mountain pine beetle may be a good argument. Longer fire seasons, and it's kind of, we're experiencing things we've never seen before, and this is a problem if you're fire management and you're getting things that are novel. Okay? And we expect more and more fire in the future, and we have to change. We have to adapt to this new reality. I don't like new normal because there's nothing normal about this. It's not a plateau. We're on a trajectory downhill, and this is only going to get worse. Okay? Fire and society will continue to interact, and we have to learn to live with fire smoke. I know people don't want to hear that. We can make our communities more fire resilient. Fire is a multifaceted problem, need multi-pronged solutions. There's no silver bullet. There's no vaccine for this, okay? We have to learn to live with fire. And prescribed fire is one option that people don't seem to like, but it's a really good option. And here's another picture of a fire. This one's from the territories and just some of the sponsors and the people I work with. And I haven't had time to talk much about Canada Wildfire, but do check it out. We're on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. We have lots of talks on there, a great website. So if you're interested in fire, check us out. And I think I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen. If I can find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Flannigan. So right now we'll take time for a couple of questions before Amanda gets started. And I'll peek into the Q&A here. So and please type your questions in the Q&A, and you can also indicate ones you're interested in by clicking on the up thumb to vote it up. Now, the first question here, considering the 3 requirements for fire, would areas that have burned recently be less likely to be impacted by a future event, as the fuel would be minimal or decreased?
Yes, great question. And it's true that usually a recent fire is unlikely to reburn for 10, 15, 20 years. And if it's a peat bog, more like 50 years. The exception is that if you get grass come back right away, the grass can burn, but it'll be lower intensity, and fire management can handle that. So, and that's why we want fire back on the landscape, because it creates this patchwork quilt of recently burned areas. So you're less likely to get these large catastrophic fires that spread across the landscape because they bump into these recently burned areas.
Okay, so another question here. Is there any correlation between forest management practices and wildfire intensity? For example, large amounts of less diverse stands of similar age, less old growth, biodiversity, et cetera. How do these things affect fire?
Well, and you know, there's people on this session that are probably better able to answer this, like Dr. Laurie Daniels. But you know, the short answer is forest management practices does affect fire because it affects the fuel, what type, how much, and how it's distributed vertically. We call them ladder fuels that promote crown fires because it spreads from the surface and it has a stepping stone up into the tops, the crowns of the tree, promotes crown fires, how it's distributed vertically. So yes, so it's very context dependent. How old is the stand? How thin is the stand? What fuel type is the stand? So I'm sorry, I can't give more detailed answers, but yes, it's a very involved relationship between forest management and fire.
Okay, here's a management specific question related to, I guess, the flooding that we're having right now. So why don't we aerial seed cover crops onto the burned areas to hold the soil and jumpstart regrowth?
Great suggestion. Now, some places do aerial seed of tree species, same sort of thing, but absolutely we want to stabilize recently burned areas, especially in areas with a topography where there's significant slopes, because that increases the runoff and the likelihood of a mudslide. So that's a great idea. And I'm not sure, I'm not in the recovery phase. They may be doing that, but if they're not, that is a great suggestion.
And one more management question, and I think then we'll move it on. So when it comes to management, what is the difference between achieving the patchwork you mentioned using fire versus removing fuel without burning?
So, and we may, because of the problems with the acceptance of prescribed burning, removing fuel, through logging is maybe the only option in some areas. And, I have a colleague in Banff, and she can't, Jane Park, she can't burn within 3 kilometers of the community because it's a tourist location. So they do use logging. But, you know, it's not as natural as fire is from an ecosystem point of view, but it will help protect communities, especially if, you know, you just don't log and leave the slash. You have to remove all the slash too, because you want to reduce the amount of fuel. But yes, that is an option, and that's part of vegetation management, and it is used. And I expect there'll be significant funding. There has been significant funding in the past from BC and Alberta to manage fuels around communities. And a lot of this is thinning through logging or replacing conifers with more deciduous species, more broadleaf. So yeah, that is an option that we are using and will continue to use.
All right, well, thank you so much. And we're now going to move on. So I'd now like to introduce Amanda Miller. Amanda is a professional agrologist and owner of Palouse Rangeland Consulting. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She has a passion for rangeland stewardship and conservation. She has been leading research for the BC Cattlemen's Association to look at how cattle grazing can support wildfire resilience. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. All right, I'll get my presentation up here. All right, can you see my slides? Awesome. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the introduction. So I would just like to acknowledge the land where this specific project that I'm talking about took place. It was on the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa Nation, home to the Ktunaxa people, which has always been a land of teaching, learning, and research. So I'd like to pay respect to the Ktunaxa people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land in this specific project area I will be talking about. So Mike gave a really great sort of overview, large scale view about some of the issues associated with wildfire, both globally and like specific to British Columbia and Western Canada. And so I'm going to be talking on a lot finer scale about a specific project area. So the lead into this is where did this come from? Where did the idea of targeted grazing for wildfire risk reduction come from? Well, the 2017-18 fire seasons were massive impacts across British Columbia. And one of the things that came out of it was that there was value shown in agricultural practices on the impact and their impact on fire behavior. So agricultural practices, specifically grazing, in addition to cropping, showed some value in changing fire behavior. They would slow, turn, or stop fires, sort of creating these agricultural fire breaks across the landscape that were really helpful with assisting in fire management and the fire response in those areas. So after those fire seasons and these observations were made, the British Columbia Cattlemen's Association partnered with the province and a number of rancher partners to develop a pilot program. And this pilot program was aimed at investigating wildfire risk reduction through this practice called targeted grazing. So targeted grazing is used in these pilot areas to reduce or break up fine fuel loads and wildfire risk next to communities, utilities, and transportation corridors. So really next to community infrastructure that could be, is very valuable and things like that. So to back up on this, okay, it's great. We're going to implement targeted grazing in these areas, but what is targeted grazing? So targeted grazing actually has a specific definition. It's the use of a specified kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish defined vegetation and landscape goals. So where this comes into play with wildfire resiliency around communities is that most of our fuel management projects, fire smarting around a community, wildfire risk reduction projects, they're focused really on tree canopy characteristics. So they're looking at removing trees, decreasing your crown density, decreasing the number of trees per hectare, potentially changing species. Mike mentioned about changing from conifer and adding in deciduous, things like that. And or they look at pruning and removing understory as a component of that. So one of the outcomes of this is that you have increased herbaceous material across these areas, mainly in the form of grass, is what often comes up in the interior parts of British Columbia. And this is a really volatile and easily ignited fuel type when it dries. So, Mike had mentioned about grass curing and everything, and basically it becomes a tinderbox. It's very easy to set it on fire. That's how we all make fires, is we have something fine that is easy to set. You don't just like hold a lighter up to a whole log, right? So unfortunately, that's one of the outcomes, is that you're sort of trading in ways fuel types when you're doing these fuel management reduction projects focused on the overstory. So that's where targeted grazing comes in as a land use, is that we're looking to target that sort of fine fuel load that's associated with an increase in light resources in an open canopy. So the goal around this is to reduce those fine fuel loads that come up after those overstory treatments, and to break up the fuel continuity while still ensuring that other values, such as your biodiversity values, wildlife habitat, things like that, are not negatively impacted from these treatments. And so in these areas, that means that we'll be continuing to reach our stubble height and forage use levels that are allowed. So, and this is occurring across areas where cattle are already on the landscape. And, there is the potential that you could use something such as mowing or other mechanical options to reduce the fine fuel levels, but we already have grazing animals on these landscapes anyway. And so it's just a good way to use existing resources and range agreements. So where exactly did this happen? Well, we implemented this project in 2020 across 4 different study sites, one located in Peachland, one in Summerland, and then 2 in Cranbrook. And so monitoring to see the effect of cattle on mitigating fine fuel occurs within this area of interest, which is 2 kilometers from our community infrastructure, and our intensive data collection is concentrated within the 400 meters of community infrastructure. And so this 400-meter distance is used by the Wildfire Service for effective planning around communities, because that's associated with spotting distances from fires. And so that's kind of what we went with. So as I mentioned, the monitoring has these 2 main components. The intensive monitoring is occurring once a season, and then the extensive monitoring occurs every 2 weeks during the grazing period. So just to look at some of our extensive design, it's occurring, of course, in that 2-kilometer boundary area, and it provides us a broad coverage of the pilot site occurring every 2 weeks during the grazing period. And it is where we go out and we look at what are our leading plant species, the height associated with them, and their estimated percent cover. We estimate the grazing use on them, the fuel continuity across the area, and then we also have other assessments that are of value for ecological functions, such as riparian health assessments. And then, of course, different attributes that are important to have, such as slope, aspect, and other notes, because those things play into how fire behavior moves across an area. So for our intensive design, it's where we're gathering enough data that can be quantitative rather than qualitative. These occur on small, randomly selected macroplot areas that are within that 400-meter boundary area. And it's data that can be used for statistical inferences. And we do our data collection there after grazing is completed for the season. And we do collect an awful lot of data on this. It's variables. There's 16 different variables that we monitor, everything from biomass, forage clippings, to plant identification and percent cover using transects. We assess substrates, we assess woody fuel cover on the ground, we assess, plant heights, woody fuel heights, moisture, fuel moisture, fine fuel continuity, conifer regeneration, and then a lot of information around range health assessments, such as soil moving, plant recruitment, biological soil crusts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a huge suite of data that we collect. And this occurs, this is a little map of the macroplot areas where we have that intensive data collection occur. And then this is just a diagram of what these macroplot areas look like. And I shouldn't have called them small. They're actually pretty big. They're 100 meters by 30 meters in size. And so we have randomized forage cages where we're assessing the grazing impact relative to areas where no grazing occurs in forage cages there. And then along with a large baseline transect. So there's a lot of characterization of the plant communities that goes into play. So that's one really important piece of this, because we're not looking at this just from the perspective of wildfire risk reduction. We're also looking at it from the perspective of maintaining ecosystems and the ecological goods and services that they provide. So a big piece of that is characterizing what the current plant community is. So within this study site at the East Cranbrook study site, we have characterized the plant community as a Douglas fir, Western larch, Oregon grape, and pine grass Western fescue community, which is associated with the Beck site series up everyone can see on the screen. It's fir, larch, pine grass, twin flower 101 of the IDF DM2. And so now that we know, we've characterized the plant community, we have data on what it looks like currently, and we can monitor it annually to see if there's shifts in the species associated with that plant community. So if the plant community begins to shift and, pine grass cover starts to be reduced greatly from the grazing impact, we know that that's a negative thing that's coming out of it. And if we're having more sort of increaser species come in, weedy species, we know that the grazing treatment is too heavy and it's having negative impacts on the ecosystem. So we've done 2 years of monitoring at this study site now, and it is in good health overall. The plant communities have vigorous native species associated with forested areas, and then there's some seeded agronomic communities that are also, really healthy and productive. And then as part of the extensive monitoring, we characterized the average grazing use from the treatment in 2020 at 24% across the study area. And this is just important to monitor annually because, herbaceous plant species do react relatively or respond relatively quickly to disturbance. And you can start seeing shifts and changes in the plant community if you're overachieving on your disturbance. So one of the most important pieces around how does this impact fire behavior is around biomass. It's the amount of fuel that is present on the site. And so one thing we found on this site in Cranbrook is that total biomass in 2020 was significantly different between our non-grazed sample controls and our grazed samples. We saw a 40% reduction in living biomass and a 25% reduction in total biomass. And it's interesting because we actually had more litter on our grazed sites than our non-grazed sites, which is a little bit counterintuitive because usually litter reduces with grazing impact. But we're assuming, well, we're not assuming, we found in the literature that grazing in pine grass can be associated with increased litter just because the way that the cattle graze on it, and that it's a rhizomatous species that can be pulled out of the ground relatively easily, when in comparison to bunch grass species such as blue bunch. So it seems that the grazing impact is actually increasing litter, and which is an interesting outcome of this. So anyway, aside from that, there was an increase in litter on the grazed sites, but overall there was still a reduction in total biomass from the grazing treatment relative to the non-grazed controls. And then the other really important piece when it comes to fire behavior is also around stubble height. So stubble height is where we measure the height of the grass, basically. And that gives us an idea because the longer the grass is, of course, the longer your flame length is going to be. And then the shorter the grass is, the less easily a fire can move through it. And the shorter your flame length will be, your intensity is going to be reduced. So we found that when we compared our grazed and non-grazed controls, that grazing reduced the stubble height by 34% on pine grass, which was the dominant grass, on those grazed samples relative to the non-grazed controls. And so this is great. Of course, it makes sense, you know, intuitively that grazing is going to reduce the height of the grass. But one really important piece to that is that although there was this 34% reduction, we did not go below the minimum recommended stubble height for pine grass or any of the species for that matter. So the minimum recommended stubble height for pine grass is 18 centimeters. And then if you start grazing below that, you can be overachieving and having negative impacts on the plants. So although we were effectively reducing the height of these grass species, we weren't negatively impacting their health. And so this is actually a great picture of some of the even uniform use we got of pine grass across the site. We found in summary that grazing in the 400-meter zone was considered moderate. We're seeing, you know, that like basically reduction by about a third. So biomass and stubble heights on these grazed versus non-grazed areas showed a total biomass reduction of 25.5%, and then height reduction of our dominant species pine grass was reduced by 34%. Which implies that grazing is likely to have a moderate effect on fire behavior in that critical 400-meter zone. And that's mainly through those reductions in your overall biomass and the height. So, you know, as you're reducing the fuel load and the structure, you're reducing the fuel structure height, you're going to have reductions on your fire behavior. And so we're working on achieving or finding modeling that can show this in a quantitative way. So that's the next step of this. But overall, it was good use. It was even use across the area. It's likely to have some good reductions in fire behavior, but we're also finding that we're not negatively impacting ecosystem health and function through this work. So it's implying that grazing, and you know, we'll continue monitoring on into the future, but basically the first 2 years of monitoring have shown us that we are effectively reducing the fine fuel loads in the area without having negative impacts on the ecosystem. And so hopefully that trend continues as this project goes forward into the future. So what does this all mean? Well, this picture I think is a great, you know, just encapsulates the whole issue that we have here. So this is a range reference area, which has the area inside the fence has not been grazed for many, many decades. And then the area outside the fence has received grazing. And so on the inside, we have, you know, like this overgrown, decadent, dead, dried out, easily ignitable fuel and lots of it, and it's continuous across the area. So that represents a major fire hazard, and that's what we want to avoid. But then on the other side of the fence, we have something that's been grazed relatively heavily in a way that's likely impacting ecosystem health and function and reducing a lot of the, you know, goods and services that humans and wildlife rely on these landscapes for. So really what we want is we want to find a middle ground between these two. We want to be able to reduce our fire hazard without negatively impacting our ecosystem health. So that's really a tough balancing act to find, not just from the perspective of environmental perspective, but also socially. It can be difficult to sort of walk that line in areas that are next to communities, because this work all takes place in areas that are really close to community infrastructure, because of course that's where the risk is. And it can be difficult sometimes to get community buy-in on that, with people, you know, not necessarily wanting to see animals, livestock right out their back door. So before I kind of close out on this, I want to mention some of our funding support. It was provided through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership and the Ministry of Forest, Land, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. And as well, the BC Wildfire Service was a big player as well. So special thanks to Reg Newman, who's the lead researcher for this project, and Shauna Larad, the range officer for the Rocky Mountain District, who's been a huge champion for the projects in the Cranbrook area. And for this pilot site, our tenure holder rancher partner that we partnered with was Jordy Thibault, and he volunteered to participate in this pilot project and did a lot of work with putting up electric fences and managing cattle and engaging with the community. So He's been an awesome, awesome partner for this project and has been able to effectively, get community buy-in and apply the treatment in a way that seems to be ecologically sustainable and helps mitigate wildfire risk. So with that, I will stop sharing. All right.
Thank you, Amanda. And I'm going to start with a question of my own. I was backpacking this summer in the Snowy Mountain area south of Carameas, and there was one of these exclusion plots way up in the high alpine grasslands there. And we seemed to be a far away from cattle grazing. So it would have been the wild species herbivores up there. And we still had that similar kind of pattern. So inside the exclusion area, there was a lot more material. Makes me wonder, if it wasn't for cattle, how much control of those finds would be from the wild herbivores?
Well, that's a good question. So of course, it depends on the area and everything. So in the East Kootenays, there is a large elk population, though it has seen declines in recent years. So they may be able to provide some level of fine fuel mitigation, but they're potentially not in as large a numbers that it could be effective. It definitely wouldn't be as even in use as you get under cattle, which are managed relatively intensively. And then also there are differences in the way that different ruminants graze. So elk, for example, are intermediate feeders. So they will eat both graminoid types of species and browse species like shrubs and forbs and things like that. Cattle are bulk feeders or grazers, and so they will select primarily for grassy species. And then that's when also things like people talk a lot about using goats for targeted grazing for fine fuel mitigation, which works in some areas where you're in areas that ecosystems that are primarily shrubs, but goats generally don't eat grass. They select more for shrubs and forbs and things like that. So you kind of have to think about matching the ruminant to the problem. So yes, potentially in areas that have large amounts of ungulates that could use the fine fuels as forage, they could provide some of a reduction.
Thank you. Now moving on to some of the other questions. One question here, how can the data being collected in the targeted grazing work be used to advocate for policies that support managing lands for more than timber values? So that's part one. And then part two is, do you notice a difference in attitude around incorporating livestock in management between different regions in BC?
So the first part of the question, I feel like it could probably help influence policy, and just hopefully just from the perspective of having fine fuel be a component of wildfire risk reduction projects. This data is showing that once you open the overstory, you're getting like X amount of fine fuels that come up from it. And we can show that with our non-grazed samples. So I'm hopeful that this data can be used to say like, hey, it's great that you're doing all this wildfire risk reduction work, but there's another component to it that is more volatile in some cases. And then do I see a difference in the attitudes between communities? Yes, I do. So it just depends on communities that are a little bit more rural and where the general public has more interaction with the agricultural sector. They're generally a bit more approving of having livestock in these sort of areas next to community infrastructure, whereas there's a little bit more hesitancy around areas that are more urban in makeup and maybe don't have quite that same interaction with the agricultural sector. And part of that too is actually because if you're not exposed, I find, to livestock, they can kind of be a little bit scary. Like, I mean, growing up in ranching, cows don't really scare me, but they are big animals. And I could definitely see why it would scare someone to come across a 1,200-pound animal on a walking trail, just out their back door. So I do understand where some of this hesitancy and concern comes from.
Thank you. That brings me to another question from me. the urban deer problem, so that many communities have. Any sense of, if you have cattle grazing around a community, does that discourage deer from moving through that area into the communities?
Well, see, it's interesting because, as I mentioned before, they do have different forage preferences. So there's been actually a fair bit of work on whether or not cattle presence impacts things like animals like deer and elk. And so it's not specifically that they're competing for forage. There has been really mixed results in some of that research, where in some cases the cattle and deer coexist and there's no issues, like it doesn't impact the deer population to have, or the deer presence to have cattle there, because they don't have any sort of conflict. And then other research has shown that that cattle presence does stop deer from entering specific areas. So it's really, the research is relatively mixed on that. And I can't really say one way or another because I haven't done any work on that specific piece in these specific areas.
Okay, so maybe I should let people from the audience ask questions too. So one here says, I noticed that the shrub biomass decreased even more than the forbs and grasses. So are the shrubs, reducing the shrubs, important for slowing fires?
Yes, reducing shrub for sure is an important outcome of reducing these fine fuels. And it is interesting because cattle do not select for shrubs. So we're wondering if maybe it's a trampling effect that's coming out. And also I would mention too that the shrub component of these communities is Oregon grape, and it was quite short too. So it was about, like 20-30 centimeters tall. So it wasn't, I feel like it might have been a little bit of a trampling effect that reduced the shrubs, but it's actually, not a terrible outcome to have when your objective is wildfire or fire risk reduction.
Okay. Another question here. Somebody, I guess, who has really good eyes says, I'm seeing a lot of invasive species moving into the Cranbrook sites. Any thoughts on this? And do we have the tools to deal with this issue?
Okay. So the site that the two sites that we have in Cranbrook, one has no invasive species on it, and the other one has bull thistle on it, which is an outcome of logging and generally drops out of the community after a couple of years. Some of my other work in the Cranbrook area, specifically south of Cranbrook, has shown some invasive species, sulfur cinquefoil, cheatgrass, St. John's wort. There is always, anytime that you have disturbance in an ecosystem, it often is associated with increases in bare soil. And then that creates vectors for weeds areas for weeds to establish. And then of course, anywhere that you have a significant amount of human disturbance or human use of an area, you do have vectors for weed spread through biking, hiking, equestrian use, things like that. So because it's often these areas right adjacent to communities are multiple use landscapes that support not just grazing, but also forestry and also recreational use, there's a lot of opportunity for weeds to get in and spread throughout those areas. And I wouldn't pin it on any sort of land use in particular. Anytime there's a land use, there's going to be the potential for weeds to come in and spread across those communities. Unfortunately.
Okay. So Mel Intersection just left, but he said here, fascinating work, Amanda. Is there any need for more hands to help process a large and diverse amount of data you're gathering? Are there volunteer opportunities? So
well, I could talk to the Cattlemen about that, but if someone could come help me weigh forage samples, I would love it. That's the most boring job out there.
Bob Jameson asks, to both Michael and yourself, do you know if anyone has tried to calculate how much of the area burned in the Okanagan and Kamloops area was grassland or logged areas versus forage stands? Is anyone trying to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from these fires? So even a simplistic calculation might wake people up to the scale of what happened this past year.
Well, I'll let Mike speak to this first.
So there is a carbon accounting that does take into consideration what was burned. It's led out of the Canadian Forest Service in Victoria. BC may have their own calculations as well. Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question, but there are people probably in the province and the feds who do. And yes, disturbances like fire are in part the reason why our Canadian forests are now a carbon source rather than a carbon sink that naturally they often are. So it is a major consideration. And as we pay more and more price per ton of carbon, it's going to become an economic question. And maybe John, you can join in there. But yeah, Amanda, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I would just like to add that one interesting difference between, fire moving relative to carbon between fire moving through forests versus grassland ecosystems is that in grasslands, most of the carbon is actually stored below ground through the root system and as organic soil organic material. And so even when you do have a fire come through a grassland that burns the above ground material, it releases less carbon than, say, a forest fire, just because the nature of the carbon storage, it's different. It's mostly underground, so it's more stable sort of carbon sink.
And just for some numbers, forest fires on average consume about 2.5 kilograms per meter squared, and about half of that is carbon, just under half. Right? So, and you're right, Amanda, combustion of grasses are much lower than that typically, unless it's a really heavily matted stand with tall grass. Yeah.
And ecosystem services from these grazed landscapes has come up. So a couple of questions here. One is about what are the metrics that you're using for ecosystem health and biodiversity use, and then kind of related, and what sort of management of these grazed areas to protect water sources from the impacts of grazing is part of this program?
Yeah, for sure. So we're using the Upland Range Health Assessment protocol through the Ministry of Forest Land Resource. There's a lot of names to it. FLNRO. So we're using their Upland Range Health Assessment protocol to sort of quantify what the how the ecosystem is functioning. And so it looks at a number of different aspects and indirectly correlates them to having a fully functional ecosystem. So, and then relative to the water sources, so one of the components of this project, because it is sort of shifting the timing of, the timing of grazing and shifting the numbers of animals into specific targeted areas. One of the pieces of that is that we have invested in fencing for wetland areas and riparian areas to sort of safeguard those values from any potential changes in the intensity of use across a shorter period of time. So there has been fencing of wetlands and dugout areas, things like that, and also water developments have been added to sort of provide a more even distribution of animals across the target areas. So that has been a component of it, and we do also use the riparian health assessment protocol through FLNRO as well to assess the health of those riparian areas every 2 weeks during the grazing period. So it's definitely a big part of this, because especially in these grassland wetland complexes, there's a lot of species at risk values and a lot of really important ecosystem function that occurs there.
And thank you. We're going to have one last question which got a whole lot of upvotes. So it's mostly directed, I think, at you, Mike. So can you speak more on the emergency shelter options versus full evacuation? Are there other jurisdictions with similar forests to BC that do this? And what are the consequences if something goes wrong?
So emergency shelters, they're primarily would be for remote communities, fly-in in particular, or places with only one road access. And other, you know, I just think that, you know, I'm not a social scientist, but I have colleagues who are, and I've talked to people who've been evacuated, you know, and even people from Slave Lake 10 years later, it's almost like PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or whatever that is. So if possible, you know, having options to not evacuate would be useful. Other areas, Australia has a very flammable forest, and they have a policy sometimes to stay. The trick is don't leave when the fire's upon you, because many of the fatalities happen people in cars trying to leave. So if you are in a shelter, stay in a shelter, and they can be made fireproof with clean air supply. They can be made safe, okay, as long as people. One of the biggest issues I see is communication during an emergency. And I'm a big proponent of having sirens, okay? It works for tsunamis, it works for tornadoes. I think we should be using them for fire, because sometimes, you know, not everyone's on social media, and sometimes the cell towers go down or the power goes down. So simple old siren, you know, seems to work. So it's a very involved, complicated topic, but I think this is one option for certain communities.
Yeah, and I am one of the social sciences scientists here, and that's one of the conversations we've had as well, is how do you enable people to be more involved rather than just telling everybody to get out? Because a lot of people would like to stay and try and do something, but that may make it too late for them to flee. And so having some kind of an emergency shelter as a retreat, which certainly any of the fire response crews establish that retreat safe zone when they're protecting areas. And maybe we should work with the community more rather than just the way we do it now, which is get them out and let the professionals deal with things. So anyhow, thank you for all of the answers to the questions and for the great presentations. And we should be wrapping things up so that we have time to move on to the next panel. So we haven't had a chance to answer everybody's questions, so we encourage you to reach out to the presenters. By the sounds of it, Amanda will take volunteers as well. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can go to the LinkedIn page or to ACARN's website and get more information there on how to be further connected. So thanks again to the presenters. Thanks again to everybody who joined us. And you'll probably see some of us again, or at least our names in the next session. Bye for now.
Thank you.